voice and then you. My guest today is Miss Joy Broughton. She is here to talk about her most recent research, Making the Titanic Shift, Designing Teacher Preparation to Meet the Needs of Dual Language. Joy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Tell me, let's just jump right in. Where should we take teacher prep today? What can you tell us about the ideas that you've got that obviously require a Titanic shift, hence the very clever title. So please go ahead and tell us a little bit about what we can do.
Okay, when we think about teacher preparation, it's been around for over 100 years, and it has always been focused on navigating towards meeting the needs of the students that teachers are going to teach.
And for our listeners, Joy has brought in this really fantastic infographic with a compass, and north is students. Okay, please continue.
Okay, so yeah, we have on this graphic a Titanic ship, which is teacher preparation, and this ship is headed towards an iceberg. And that iceberg today are English language learners.
I hope they don't meet the same fate as what happened in the movie.
Neither do myself included, and
Okay.
we're going to talk about how we can make that Titanic shift so we don't hit the iceberg.
Great, and I can tell that you've got a lot of preparation because the image that I'm seeing has 4 smokestacks. There's a lot to unpack here. So please continue.
Okay, so when we think about who are our students today in schools today, we have 25% of our students are English language learners. And those students speak a language other than English in their homes. So they could also be considered dual language learners because they're acquiring their native language along with their second language of English.
So they've got this iceberg. We know a little bit about them, but obviously there's a lot under the surface.
Right. When you see the student, you might think they already have acquired English. Often there's such a range. They can come straight from another country as a first-generation immigrant. They could have been in the country already a few years, and so they can have a conversation with you. So what we might first see about them interacting with us in their classroom as teachers is that they seem to be functional.
Right.
They seem like they can access the content. But what's masked for the teacher is what that student is carrying when they walk in that classroom. What is underneath the surface, the iceberg. So I just want to take a minute for our listeners and kind of describe who the English language student is.
Please.
And how to think about what they're bringing to the table when they walk in the classroom. So I'm going to do this in terms of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. And this puts the student at the center, surrounded by concentric circles. And each one of these circles represents that student's capacity to learn and the interaction they have with the world around them. So students come with their own capacity, their own cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and that interacts with the home environment. You know, do they have a literacy-rich environment at home? Have they been exposed to a strong home language? And around that home circle is their experience in the community and in their schools, in church, just kind of their general day-to-day interactions.
Which is really fascinating because if they're operating with a different north and the other areas of their life have a different north, you can really start to see how challenging it is for the educator in the classroom. Because now not only is the educator responsible for navigating these icy waters with their program, but now they have to help a student also navigate.
Exactly. And that teacher really is coming with a completely different package. That teachers had experience with only one language and only one culture. And they haven't had to walk in the shoes of their ELL student. And so around that student, school, and community, they also have the societal factors that they're coming in with.
Yes.
What's their socioeconomic status? What are the features of which school they even end up going to? That can be controlled by the situation in the city that they live in. So all of that unpacking is something that a typical undergraduate pre-service teacher has never had to do in their lives before.
So the first step really is people, before they even get to the front lines, they need to know how to navigate the boxes and the ice that are, floating around.
Right.
Okay, in our seas. And really get into sounds like the shoes of the students. Because a lot of them may not have that experience or exposure.
Right. So when I talk about how are we going to orient this Titanic of teacher preparation, we have 3 main areas of knowledge that teachers need, and then practice. And so we've kind of already touched on the knowledge of self. Like teachers need to be gain and not have a process of learning how to gain knowledge of the cultural background that they bring to the table.
So some self-reflection is an important part of this, okay?
And so you can think of like their knowledge of self being deeply connected to their ability to have knowledge of the learner. It's all what has been termed in the literature as cultural competence. So knowing that we all have these concentric circles that Bronfenbrenner describes, and in order to know how to plan our instruction for our learner, we need to be able to unpack that and ask those questions so that we aren't just sitting down at the table and asking that student to read with us, but we understand, they might not have eaten the night before. And what else is they're bringing to the table that's going to make that complex for me to plan instruction for them?
Absolutely. So having an awareness of ourselves, having an awareness of all these other variables underneath the tip of the iceberg, and really being able to apply them to how we approach those students, and keeping in mind issues such as hunger or an economic situation at home, for instance. So that's the first step, that
Right.
cultural competency.
Right.
Okay.
The next step is having an understanding of language and language development. So that student is coming to the classroom with 2 languages, and they might be at various levels of learning in both of those languages. And in order for that teacher to help the student access our educational system and the content that they're going to provide, the teacher needs to be aware of language development theory. They need to know what will be the next step for that student in their stage of learning English.
So the teachers need to be adequately prepared with the background information and the background knowledge about how to recognize learning, and then how to approach each of the students, for instance, with, let's say, their learning style.
Yes, learning style definitely fits into that as well. And that would go back to even cultural competence as well, because you've got totally different style of learning coming from a student from China versus a student from Brazil, for instance.
Okay, thank you. And tell me about the other smokestacks on
Okay.
this big ship.
So the last area of knowledge that students need to come with are how do we instruct students? And that has its own area of theory. That's why it's kind of separated from the language development theory, because we can understand the stages of how children acquire language, but then how do we help them acquire language, and how do we help them access content within our instructional plans? Has its own area of theories that teachers need to be knowledgeable about when they plan their lessons.
Right, so they need to come to the table with the background and the education themselves, be able to assess skills, and then be able to put it together in practice for the students to actually tie together all of the elements that will help both the students and the educators reach their goals.
Exactly. And that part, surprisingly, is so tricky. When I looked at several different studies that have surveyed teachers on their belief systems and then observed them in their classroom, we've seen that even if they have informed beliefs about dual language learners and understanding this iceberg that they come from, they don't necessarily connect that with putting into some effective practices in the classroom. And in fact, most cases, if they don't have professional development specifically focused on that, they're not putting in linguistically responsive practices. They're using the general best practices that we've used for the past 100 years. So that leads me to why we need to make a Titanic shift.
Yeah, so practice is really twofold. It's the literal practice, and it's also the experience. And so, and that applies to, it sounds, the educators as well as the students, but mostly the educators and the theory and the assessments and the education that they're working with.
Yes, all those pieces. And it's so complex that it needs to happen in a situation at school sites where you have a model teacher who has figured out how to navigate the sea, who has figured out how to reach these English language learners and cater their instruction to fit their needs. And so a pre-service teacher needs that highly structured field experience in order to have the self-efficacy when they enter their classrooms as a new teacher to use these practices.
That really sums up, I think, these smokestacks that you've got, and really clarifies also the practice element and tying it back to beginning teachers, pre-service teachers. Are there any other steps that you would like to share with the audience about how teacher educators can effectively prepare to serve these students?
I think, there are theories out there in terms of how we can prepare and what we can do using professional development schools and partnerships between universities and schools in terms of, there's various issues about how we address each of these areas of knowledge and teach them within a program. But the thing I want to leave you with today is the thought that making the Titanic shift is about refocusing teacher preparation programs to who we're serving today. And so that means that rather than thinking of preparing teachers for English language learners as adding more courses or having a checklist of experiences that they have to teach a student within their school, it's a whole shift of our teacher preparation programs. And it needs to be infused throughout the program and not just an add-on. And the good news is we think there's just so many competing factors that there's too much for a teacher preparation program to cover. But in fact, I think with these areas of knowledge that I laid out and the practice, these can be overlapping with the best practices that we have known and done for the last century. And we're just taking them to the next level in a more in-depth look.
And getting the boat back on track.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Chrissy.